of YouTube is I went to the same place and filmed that same activity from the same angle. Couldn't find the film and found this on YouTube. It's amazing. But I actually spoke with them about it, and a lot of people are injured. They can show you scars from where they fatigued and got out of sequence and were hit by someone else. So it's a very intense activity.
I think that responds to the question of whether there's an evolutionary advantage. Right?
Yeah, if we decide to call that music, then definitely so.
Well, I mean, they kind of think they're making music a little bit there, right? I mean,
sure. And a lot of music that comes from there imitates that exact sort of sequence, you know. And when people work on, when they do working songs, and when you see a similar thing when you're watering rice paddies. The water doesn't like to go uphill, as you might imagine, and you have a team of people that has to very tightly coordinate how they guide the water down the hill so they flood the paddies at the right time. And again, they're all singing, they're all clapping, they're doing this stuff as they cut canals and move tubes around. So timing is very important. And in Bali, a lot of Balinese have complained to me that you really can't do anything alone. You get up in the morning, you walk down the street, and you have to help this guy with his roof, then this person with their cow, and then by the end of the day, you've made it down the street to do whatever you're going to do. And it's because there's a lot of this idea of team effort is just so important in that culture. So let's go back to the topic at hand, Gamelan, synchrony and attention. So over the years, I've taught well over 1,000 kids, and they come into my classroom, and American kids learning Gamelan. And there are actually a few programs similar to this. Mostly it happens at older ages in college and things like that. But as you saw, the tight synchrony is what's required in Gamelan. Anytime you have a hard wooden hammer and you're hitting a piece of metal, you know, attack timing is just very crucial and very, very obvious. So I'd have kids come in who were talented musically, they could learn sequences well, they had no problem with some aspects of coordination except for interpersonal coordination. They could not synchronize with other kids. Say, okay, you've got the sequence, that's great. Now just play it with everyone else. And invariably they drag or they get ahead of the beat and kind of float around and just not lock in with what was going on around them. To my surprise as a teacher, these kids were kids who had ADHD. And it got to the point that I could get a new batch of kids into the room and listen to them clap or play something together and just say, oh, this one, that one, that one. Go talk to the counselor, sure enough, those were the kids. I say surprisingly, partly because I came into this not really believing in ADHD very much. You know, it seemed to be some kind of conspiracy. That's Victor's phone. Some kind of conspiracy to sell methamphetamines to children or something. You know, a lot of teachers think that way, right? And so I just really didn't take it very seriously. But over and over and over again, I saw this. And as a teacher, as a musician, I was working on my PhD. I just went into the literature on timing and ADHD, and sure, this huge body of literature came up. I was hoping that someone had an answer for me, and then I could just go and apply it in my classes. But no one really did. There's a lot of literature on it, though. Just to go back to synchronizing with an isochronous pulse, and I think you've probably discussed this quite a bit throughout the week, right? So I'll be very quick with this. Just to think about the cognitive processes involved in this, though. Suppose the green lines are your target pulse, the red is you trying to synchronize. First thing you do is you match. You estimate the target interval and you repeat it, right? You try and repeat whatever this interval is. In music, at least among humans, it's usually happening on the scale of hundreds of milliseconds. Then another thing is happening, though, because sometimes you're a bit early, sometimes you're a bit late. And these differences can happen on the scales of tens of milliseconds, which is really an important time scale for understanding phonemes and all of these things. This is just an important time scale in cognition in general. So you have hundreds of milliseconds, and then you have this other thing where you're monitoring your own performance. And then at the same time, you have to adjust. So you have to feed this feedback into your motor system and then adjust this interval by tens of milliseconds so that you can get back on the beat. So already we have these three different things happening simultaneously, so you're just trying to keep a beat with somebody else. Of course, most elementary school classes and anything with children looks more like this, right? There's the target beat, and then there's everyone else. So then what do? This involves selective listening. So you have to be able to selectively attend to your target pulse. And this might even happen on the microsecond scale, where you are detecting directionality. Okay, this is where I'm focused. It's hitting this ear, hitting this ear. Now I can focus on this and ignore these other people. But so you have this multiple system, this system of multiple time scales, all converging on this simple act of trying to keep a beat. I'd like to point out, and I'm sorry this is so slow, I didn't realize you'd be so small, I didn't realize you'd be so far back. So this process involves synchronization of motor output with auditory input, visual input, tactile input, proprioception. This is all happening just to keep a beat. And of course, all of these different inputs and outputs are happening at different time scales and at different levels of shall we say, granularity. We all know that auditory input is really the fastest of all of these time scales, of these clocks which we're measuring. So then if you think about it, well, if you want to take any system that works on multiple clocks that have different time scales, what would be the best way to calibrate that system? Well, it would be synchronizing to auditory, right? It would be synchronizing to your fastest time scale, which is auditory. So if you do this and you're watching, you're listening, you're imitating somebody, you have all of these things and you're trying to sort of calibrate them. So that might be one way that this happens. Of course, we've discussed music happening in multiple nested time scales from tens of milliseconds. And this is only an isochronous pulse, which isn't really even music necessarily. So we have themes and motives that happen seconds to tens of seconds, seconds to minutes, melodic phrases, chord progressions, minutes and beyond, up to hours on end of large-scale musical structures, compositions, and things like that. And of course, all of this happens with whoever you're playing with as well. So you have an ensemble. So you have to synchronize all of that and auditory and visual input, not only of whatever sound you're producing, but with everyone else. Because we generally play groups like this. I just want to point out very briefly, and then we'll go, oh, that's interesting. This animation is gone. At any rate, there's a vast amount of literature, and I'm sure you may have discussed some of this, on temporal processing and quite a number of disorders. Just looking at ADHD, schizophrenia, and autism spectrum disorders over the last 14 or so years, I found so far 600 papers that talk about some form of temporal processing and integration. Frustratingly for me, we don't see sort of phenotypes emerging. People in ADHD are looking at interval estimation, or interval reproduction, duration estimation, tapping, things like that. In autism spectrum, we're very much concerned with biological motion detection, things like that. Schizophrenia, a lot of sensory integration. So all these things are kind of going on related to these different disorders. Getting back to this particular study, our first research question was simply, does the ability to pay attention correlate with the ability to synchronize in a group setting? I would rather say, does attention behavior correlate? Because this idea of paying attention is kind of a fuzzy thing, what attention actually is. Does attention behavior correlate with ability to synchronize in a group setting? Meaning, did this thing that I observed as a teacher, could this actually be measured in some way? Then the second question, which we'll address particularly with Victor, if this correlation exists, is it solely due to differences in attentional allocation, or is it due to underlying differences in time processing? So, and this is something which you find very frustrating in ADHD literature. You take a kid and you say, okay, there's a blinking light, the temporal bisection task, right? The light flashes, another light flashes, with that longer or shorter. And one of the things you're asking the kid with attention problems to do is pay attention to these boring blinking lights. So do you even care about this task? And so one of the questions is, well, and people have asked me many times, so kids with ADHD do more poorly in music class. Is that really surprising? I mean, they're not paying attention, they're not learning as well. Why are you surprised about this? And so we're trying to look at that question and get past that. So we do this with electrophysiology. And then the sort of the holy grail of this whole thing is, since it's probably, and I'll insert probably into this, since it's probably possible to improve one's ability to synchronize through group music practice? Can such improvements translate into measurable improvements in attentional behavior? So can you kind of reverse engineer this problem and come up with an intervention? So the first question we've actually answered. We got 100 and, how many kids was it at this point? 115 or something like that? Elementary school kids together in groups of 12. And we had Gamelan-like instruments that we constructed with little piezoelectric film elements underneath each key. So we record everybody in isolation while they're playing together. And then we correlated their performance in this group setting with other kids playing like-aged kids. And then correlated that against measures of attention behavior, meaning SWAN questionnaire, which is a rating scale that their teachers filled out, meaning cognitive tasks like the Erickson Flankers task, things like that. And I'll show you the results of that in a second. This is how it looks. This is sort of a real-time demonstration of the system which Victor developed. And using vector strength analysis, we were able to follow, even in this case in real time, how well each person was synchronizing. So just to explain this briefly, kids are playing the instruments we designed. You'll see me on one far end playing a different instrument that just keeps the beat. And the kids were asked just to play along with me. And this sort of radar thing, how you interpret this is in this way. The outermost ring is me keeping the beat, then each ring represents one kid. And then by playing the beat, I drive the phase, which you'll see is this radar sweep. So I'll always be roughly at 12 o'clock, and then any kid who's played with me will be lined up right there at 12 o'clock. If they're ahead of me, playing earlier, they'll be over here. If they're behind me, they'll be over here. And then every hit leaves a trace, so you get an idea of sort of the spread of their attempts to synchronize. If you have a narrow spread, then obviously you're a tighter synchronizer than if you have a wide spread. So this is how this looks and sounds. And so the colors actually represent different pitches. So when, in a second, the kids will start playing a sequence, and you'll see that we can also measure the time scale of sequences, which is another important thing. And you can see all kids have a tendency to be ahead. They're playing a sequence in double time. They're trying to at least. So you get the idea. The data looks kind of like this one in a more dry version. So this again would be phase, so this would be that circle. Each of these dots is one stripe, time is going this way. And so a poor synchronizer, the red line would be me keeping the beat, of course. Poor synchronizer you find very spread, and tighter synchronizer you find a nice peak there. One thing which is important here is we really wanted to reproduce ecologically the same experience I had in the classroom. So rather than initial instinct, which is have kids synchronizing to a metronome, let's actually get all of those parameters into play. You have selective listening, you have other kids, all of this, and then we can really look at this question. And as someone mentioned earlier, kids do synchronize differently in groups, and so that was an important component of this, looking at that. Oh, sorry, so here is our correlation matrix, and we did find a significant correlation across all the measures, and the kids, go ahead.
Well, this is how we measured synchronization, how well the kids can synchronize, but we also assessed attention. And the way we did it was using standard teaching questionnaires for attention, and using some computer-based psychometric tasks that have been associated with attention. So we correlate the two to see what is the strength of the relationship.
Yeah, I thought I mentioned that, but okay, good. So exactly. So anyway, the point is we did answer that question. The correlation does exist, and then we can go on to our other questions. We're developing various cognitive batteries, things like this. And we're looking at young kids. Okay, so having kids synchronize with that will be a little bit more fun than a metronome. And also measuring them in a group setting. Oh, sorry. This is duration estimation. And the kid has exactly that same button. Right? Unlike our previous speaker, I will present to you some of the least impressive preliminary results, but I think they're still interesting. So since that time, we published that study in 2013, and now we've been working on actual intervention studies, looking at that last question. So, so far we've done 2 kind of mini versions. We're just trying to get a handle on all of this. And intervention studies are few and far between, as you might have noticed with music, very few and far between. And it's part of the reason it's just really difficult to coordinate all this. So we went into an elementary school, got them to give us, sorry, go ahead.
Just for maybe some of you guys don't know what's an intervention study. So in the study we just showed, we showed that there's a correlation between attention and rhythmicity. Now the question that is, which is an instance of time processing, right? Now the real important question for us is, if there's that relationship, is there a causation? So if we happen to be able to improve rhythmicity, if we can improve time processing, can we improve all the other things that are associated with time processing? And the way to do that is an intervention study in which you get a bunch of kids, you divide them into groups, and you teach some kids music and some kids some control activity, and see what happens before and after.
Yeah, so in this case, we went into an elementary school and we got 30 kids, kindergartners, 6, 7 years old, and had half of them take 24 music classes. This meant that they had to give us 24 hours of their time, which is not an easy thing, plus all the pre and post testing time. And half the kids, 15 of them, got music classes, and half of them did arts and crafts during that same amount of time. And with the music classes, you'll notice that all the instruments are wired. So one of the things we did is collected data on every note that every kid played throughout every class, so that eventually we could kind of characterize their trajectory and improvements musically, see when certain improvements might have happened, that sort of thing. Here's just a little snippet of a video just so you can see what the classes are like. With kids this age, we have to play a lot of games, so they're playing, in this case, a stop game, where they're playing a sequence, and every time I hit this certain instrument, they have to stop. Anybody who plays through the signal is out. And as you'll see, they kind of enjoy this game. So you get the idea, right? So we do games like that, and during the course of this study, so we did all of our pre-tests, we started them out, and this is, I think, taken from their 4th or 5th day. Not only did they sound like that, but they could only do that for about 2 minutes at a time. And so you have to keep switching activities, keep grabbing their attention, and they really impressed me. So this is on their second to last day. So, it seemed a lot better, right? I hope you think that too. This was after 24 classes. Each class, they probably got about half an hour of music training. So at that point, I just said, wow, they sound really great. And not only that, but they did that for 40 minutes. They didn't even have to go off task. They didn't have to redirect them. They just did that for 40 minutes. And so I said, okay, let's go to post-testing. We did all our post-testing. Didn't see any changes. Didn't see any changes in anything though, meaning that their rhythmic synchrony did not improve either. And so this does tell us something. It's never sexy to just say, let's do a simple study of how much we can improve rhythm. We need to try a more fancy intervention than that, right? And so one question that hasn't really been answered is how stable is, or how stubborn is rhythmic ability, how stubborn is temporal processing? You know, maybe what you learn when you learn music in a group like this, maybe it's very stable and you're just learning all these compensatory mechanisms. Yeah?
So when you say the synchrony didn't improve either, how did you test it?
In the same way you just saw.
So in that group?
Yeah.
But didn't we just hear that it was much better?
Well, that's what you would think. And even me, a professional musician, gamelan teacher, all this, I thought, wow, they're so much better. But it turns out that their actual jitter with individual players was about the same. And what was different was their behavior, their ability to stay on task and not be just wildly flailing around. So there was a lot of noise in the first one where, you know, one kid would be just all over the place while another kid was synchronizing. Suddenly all of that disappeared. And so it gave me the impression, I really strongly believe that, wow, we've transformed these kids. This is amazing. And so I was really surprised when we actually did the synchrony tests and found out that actually, no, they're about the same. So this implies to me that we really need to work on a longer time scale and then also do further post-testing. But Victor, you want to say something?
No.
I would imagine there are probably huge individual differences, right? Because some kids probably are way better at it than others.
Well, and that's the thing. Behaviorally, some kids change tremendously. You know, there was a kid who would swim. Like he'd put down his mallet and he'd lie on his belly and he'd kind of swim away. And you'd have to go and get him back, you know. And by the end of this session, you know, he stopped his little swimming sessions and he'd be there playing, you know. Which was
His
huge,
swimming
you know?
got worse though, so there's something bad with learning music.
Yeah, so the thing is that they changed so much behaviorally, and it was really kind of difficult and shocking for me to realize that I was hearing behavioral changes and not like changes at this faster time scale of synchrony. So the best synchronized kids, and definitely our previous result was the same here. So already just in the pre-testing you could see that the best synchronizers were the best attenders, worst synchronizers were the worst attenders. Not surprisingly, the kid who swam around on his belly was a very poor synchronizer. And although he stopped doing that, he remained a very poor synchronizer by the end of this thing. This was only 5 weeks though. So what we're really eager to do is to do a much longer one. And, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, since we've been talking about preferred tempo rates, that was a really, really slow beat that the kids were trying to synchronize with. And I understand that that's more appropriate to gamelan. However, do you think part of their synchronization problem was simply that was really slow for 5-year-olds?
Yeah, so I would, let me just say one thing. I would say a couple things. And this actually also harks back to the monkey thing that we saw. It's a very peculiar situation for children because they prefer very fast tempi. But at the same time, in terms of motor control, they can only handle slower tempi. And so playing in our games, we do all kinds of things like we'll play really fast subdivisions but stay on one note for a long time, or kids can play this and say words, elevator, elevators, do things with subdivide that kind of keeps them engaged. But getting to the faster tempi, it's really hard to synchronize because they just don't have quite the level of control yet.
We did test them in different tempi though, and we saw no difference in that either. But the thing is, it's not about kids being good or bad, because what we were doing was comparing before and after. So there's not really good or bad.
Oh, and one other thing, we also did record vocal synchrony with them, sing cha 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 to a puppet that would say that. So we thought, well, maybe we can bypass some of this motor stuff because everyone is already exquisitely in control of their voice by that age. So they were good at it, and the jitter was smaller, but these jitters still remained.
So you said you didn't see any difference then for the vocal piece in sync?
No. Yeah. So not incredible results, but I still think they're interesting. And we're about to embark on a much longer study at the Children's Museum with an after-school program that'll last 6 months.
Have you considered giving them any feedback on how well they're synchronizing somehow more explicitly than? Well, as I understood the task, which might be misunderstanding it, they were just, you weren't giving them specific feedback on how coordinated they were.
Well, not when they were doing the task. In class, it's all about that. That was great. Just keep going. That was great. Or, did you feel that? Now we're grooving, everybody. You feel how everybody's playing together? This is what we want. Yeah. So, as a teacher, you give them a lot of feedback. But when you're actually trying to measure something, you just say, okay, we're going to play now.
I have to point out too that the stakes were very high for the kids because there was a really cool Chewbacca that they would win if they won that game at the end of the whole training, and the kids were talking about Chewbacca for the last 2 weeks nonstop.
We had prizes, which was a little stuffed Chewbacca doll, and so we'd say, okay, if you just hang in there and do the best job at the end of this, you're going to get Chewbacca. And we actually did that, but we gave everyone a Chewbacca,
including me, which is hanging in my wall.
I guess what I was thinking was more like if it's really the fine-grained jitter around the peak that you're focused on, if there's some way to give them either real-time or close to real-time feedback on how close they are, that might, I don't know if it might help.
Per hit, like in terms of for every hit, it's kind of difficult to do because we respond on sort of a slower time scale. But definitely when you're that well lined up with me, I'm looking at you and saying, great job, keep it up, And you can say, hey, did you hear, Sally, did you hear how tight that was? That's what we're looking for, let's keep it up, good job, But kids can't respond beat to beat that well. They need a little bit more time to adjust. Sorry.
I have another question, actually kind of tagged on to yours as well, about the feedback and things like that. Did you talk to any music educators about your methodology before going into their spaces? Anything like that? Or because I'm a music educator, I know lots of intervention studies, this kind of thing. I was just wondering if you
I've talked to quite a variety of them, and in this case, I should point out that intervention studies done in this parameters is sort of a cognitive thing. There are a lot of intervention studies that have other types of measurements than this sort of thing, like vector strength and trying to quantify everything. Absolutely. And our goal was to try and do an intervention study and bring it into sort of the quantitative realm. Thank you for pointing that out. Sorry.
Yeah, so one thing that I actually think that it would be worth discussing in general is the existence of intervention studies, because actual control intervention studies for the cognitive effect of learning music are very, very, very few. In spite of society really believes that making music is good for you, and probably I believe it too. We don't think that it has been very well established, really. So these studies where they actually take a control group, an active control group. I don't know if you have something.
I would add one thing to that, though, because I think this is a very interesting cultural divide too, because how people define, intervention studies or something being rigorous or not I've spoken to people who say, oh, hundreds exist, and people say 3 exist. And it's really kind of difficult to be in the middle of it and say, well, what are we talking about? What are our criteria by which we decide to include something or not? And definitely that's not something we've quite figured out. So in this case, we're just being as rigorous as we can. But people do learn from these studies. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so related to that, have you also, because you say that it's really important that you have this group that is doing this all together, have you also considered like having a control group that is just having individual?
Absolutely. And we haven't done that, but that's one of the many things that we would very much like to try. Control group one-on-one lessons, which may accelerate this or may hinder it in some way depending on the process involved. In our next study, we'll have an assistant, and we're taking the Balinese model, which is a group plays like this. So in Balinese pedagogy, you'll have a whole orchestra playing, some teacher just kind of leading them, and assistants will come around and sit across from people who are having trouble and just play with them. So we're going to involve an assistant in that manner in our next study, trying to give every kid equal attention, but intentionally helping out individuals face to face. Because sometimes people need you to come and kind of wake them up and not be lost in the herd, so to speak.
Okay, so then you do have the individual feedback, but you still have the group environment.
In our next study, yes. Sometime in the future, I'd love to have a separate control group where they're taking one-on-one lessons. I'm sorry.
So I mean, there's a whole another large and growing domain for intervention with young kids, either just to improve their education or to intervene in ADHD or dyslexia, and this is video games. So they're either ad hoc video games that people have commercialized, like Merced for specific purposes, dyslexia in that case, or people just use video games commercially available. How would you compare the pros and cons of music training in the way that you're doing versus improving attention, motor skills, whatever, by non-musical video attention-grabbing games?
If I could step out of the scientific box for a second and be a little speculative, I would say that, well, to use a metaphor, it often happens, well, we discovered this thing in grapefruit, this element that's really good for you, so let's put it in a pill. And now all we need to do is take this pill. And then someone comes along and says, well, actually, it turns out that unless you get this other thing that's also in grapefruit, you don't absorb it. And so you wind up saying, well, somehow taking the whole thing in its natural form helps. And in music, one thing which may have been brought up before is just the intrinsic enjoyment. There's no upper limit to how far you can take music study. If you look, anybody sing opera or do opera here? So what are the prime years of an opera singer? Like 40s, right?
Unless you're Domingo.
Yeah, but so what I'm saying is this isn't like gymnastics or something where you learn everything very early and you kind of hit your prime. You can continue to learn throughout your life. And partly what drives that is all of the other aspects of music, which would be social, cultural, and all of the other communication that goes on. Whereas when you try and take some specific parameter and just focus on that, it's not only is it difficult to get compliance, as you see in studies where they look at different kinds of video games, but they also have sort of an upper limit. So I'm not really speaking against those things, because I think they definitely could be of value, and you see that things like fast for word are used all over the country. But what we're looking at is trying to take music in its real form, with all of its richness and all of the peripheral aspects of music, and see what happens in that setting.
Another thing to say is that, and this is also a personal opinion, it's very speculative, and it has to do with my own personal taste, right? Which is, I love music and I don't like video games that much, right? But I think there's a reason for that. People don't talk much about what you lose when you do something, for example, video games. And one thing you lose is interaction with other people, for example. And you lose a lot of the richness of the real world in which humans have evolved. And I think it might be hard to know exactly what you're losing because we focus on very specific things that we care about, like attention. But there's a bunch of things that we probably don't realize that are important for us. And I think that making something that is actually organic, like is music, might give you all the benefits that you're expecting, and maybe more than you don't know. And no adverse effects because it has been tested with hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, so one thing I like to tell people, because we have to go and recruit parents to put their kids in our studies, and you say, well, the worst thing that's going to happen to your kid is they'll learn some music. You know, I mean, you're not really wasting time in the same way as if you were testing something that no one's ever done, that they'll never see again. You know, they'll just play some music and have fun. So that's kind of a nice negative outcome if the results are negative. I would like to pass it over to Victor because we do have some electrophysiology to talk about. You want to say something?
No, it's fine.
So this is looking at that sort of middle question that I had up there earlier, attentional allocation and underlying mechanisms of time processing.
Time processing has been associated with a variety of cognitive impairments, not only with attention but also with traumatic brain injury, for example. So basically everything bad that can happen to you can affect your timing. It has been associated with attention a lot, and how that association takes place. Well, they say to a kid, okay, do this time-related task, right? And the ADHD kids don't do it as good, right? But we found that many of the tasks that are given to test ADHD are not necessarily tests of attention, they are tests of compliance, right? The kid has to do what you ask him to do, right? So we think it's important to have a measure of how time is processed in the brain that is independent of the kid actually doing what you're asking them to. If we want to correlate time processing in the brain with other characteristics of the individuals. So our goal was develop this measure, right? So how time is processed in the brain independently of the overt behavior of the kids. So I don't know how many people are familiar with EEG and the things that you can look at with EEG. One very typical thing is that we can create expectations, meaning making a background statistics of the world, much like the echoes that Alex was referring to in music, and then we can break those expectations. And when the expectations are broken, there's a bigger activity in the brain, right? So, for example, now I'm listening to the fan of the projector, and I'm super used to it. It has no predictive value to me, right? But if the room is completely silent and then the fan starts, I'm gonna go, whoa, what's that? Because that could be predicting something. That is a very automatic thing that happens, and it has a signature in the brain, which is the brain activity to something that is unexpected or uncommon is usually bigger. No matter if you're performing a task or if you're watching The Simpsons with closed captions underneath, which is what our subjects are doing. So that's Alex. Unfortunately, we hadn't implemented the Simpson technology at that point, so Alex had to be sitting in a chair for hours at a time, just listening horrible beeps and boops. And here's our task or goal. So we want to find a measure of brain sensitivity to time, which is passive, and correlated with other cognitive characteristics of the individuals, which can be their attention, but it can also be specifically timing-related characteristics, like keeping the rhythm. So how do we measure the sensitivity to time? We use a typical deviant paradigm, in which we create an expectation. So all these blue lines are just beeps, exactly the same sound. So the expectation is created in time. We go beep, 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 beep. So you can hear that there's a deviant there. There's a sound that doesn't come at the time that it is expected. So in principle, what people generally do, where's the laser pointer?
It's right there on top of the thing. Here. Just press the thing in the middle. There you go.
So in general, what people do is measure the brain activity to a standard and compare it to the brain activity to the deviant. But people don't do that in time so much. And there's only 4 or 5 papers in which they did something like this. And I think the reason is because there's something that is confounding here. Because the brain activity to a long interval is always different than the brain activity to a short interval. They are very different stimuli. And the longer, because there's adaptation, the brain responds more strongly to intervals that are wider apart. So we didn't want to do that because we think that is wrong. So the way we got around that is creating an alternative condition, which you can see below, which goes tak 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 tak. So we omitted some of these faster beats. So we can compare a deviant in one condition to a standard in the other condition. But they are embedded in a sequence which is exactly alike. So the last 2 measures are exactly the same. But in one case, this feels like a deviant. In the other case, this feels like a standard. So now we can compare apples with apples. And this is Alex's brain. And we can see that this is so this is 1 beep, this is 1 beep. These 2 things are very similar, especially this one, because it has been matched for the last 2 beeps. When the deviant comes, the response is much bigger than when the standard comes. So we think that this can be a good measure of the sensitivity to time. We do other measures which are behavioral. We see how the people synchronizes to the beat, just with the drum. And we do deviant detections to see what is their perceptual thresholds to detect deviance in time. And we do these long time interval matching. So we developed these tasks with mostly one subject, and then we needed to get more subjects to scale it up. And we had a very unusual approach to do this, which is teaching science and getting subjects at the same time. And everybody loves music, and everybody finds music research super interesting, and this was very helpful for us. We are interested in science, in music, and we are also very interested in education, so we thought that this was a great opportunity to interact with high school kids, get them as subjects, but also teach them science. So we went to the school. This is a public school, but it's a charter school, so it's not that you can do this in any school. And the reason I'm telling you all this is because I think we all have this great opportunity to do something, have an experience like this, and I encourage you to do it because it's also very rewarding. So we went to this school and we taught them the science of music. We told them about the brain. We brought some EEG equipment and we were projecting the kids' brains on the projector, and the kids were loving it. So we essentially gave like 3 or 4 lessons, really. We took guitars, we talked about the physics of sound, and then we used them as subjects. And as we were using them as subjects, each little thing that we were doing during the experiment, we were explaining to them, okay, now we're gonna scratch your head because this. Now we're gonna test you for this because of that. So the kids were really involved in the scientific process, and also the kids were seeing how we would bitch because the cables would break, right? And all of a sudden, yeah, which I wish I had that experience when I was in high school, because I thought that a scientist was like a person with a white lab coat, and that they had to be a genius in order to make their living, and they were them and that was us, which could only be like lawyers or medical doctors or whatever, according to my grandmother. So they got to see that we are real humans. And we also integrated with other activities in the school, because there was a class that my friend was running on audiovisual production. So one of the kids in that class did a mini documentary about our experience, and it looks like a corny advertising for a project, but we actually had nothing to do with this. The kid just came up with all this himself. So, but we wanted to show it to you.
Victor, we have to wrap up about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, this is 3, and then I'll do 2 more.
Or rhythm, or is very poorly trained to the rhythm, they won't generate these expectations as strongly. And something that breaks the expectation won't cause such a big brain response.
We found it really dorky after that.
So maybe a sensitive person who's got a good working memory will give you a response because some part of them thought that one note was different, where someone else that was just passed by.
Because I kind of know, like, for like science, like experimental things, like this kind of stuff happens. Although this, like, actually being in an experiment is actually boosts my interest toward it's like I would either do more, or maybe even try and like set up an own experiment to like see like how something works, because it's interesting how like they did the brain's concept of time, but also used music or something and rhythm to coincide with that. That was pretty cool.
I've always held my view of science in high regard, and I've always enjoyed science and thought of it in a very professional way. And this kind of helped back why I think science is the way it is and why I enjoy it.
This is just, if anything, it emphasizes my perspective of science even more. Because actually do hands-on and actually be an experiment and a subject, which is pretty awesome.
I have to say, one of the coolest school days ever. Yes, I find that with this experiment, I have noticed more real-world implementation for science in general, and I find it very interesting.
If given the opportunity, would you like to do something again?
Yeah, definitely.
Doing this experiment again, I would totally do it.
So thank you to the kids, our subjects. So we're still in the process of gathering data. Like this, we have reached about 20, 30 kids that we did experiments on. And then there were like 60 kids that we actually taught. We replicated what we saw in Alex, and a good thing, so this is the grand average for all the kids. One good thing is that we saw a lot of individual variation. So this is all exactly the same task, but different brains. Exactly same electrode, this is CZ, which is really interesting because people in EEG typically lump together all the subjects, and we actually have, this effect can be seen very clearly subject by subject, which is encouraging that we can see something there that then we can correlate with other cognitive characteristics. Current directions. We have like 1 more minute. Alex, do you want to take over again?
Can you hear me? I think I sort of covered our current directions already. We're doing intervention studies. We're beginning one at the Children's Museum. We're continuing this electrophysiology. And I'm working towards starting sort of a music lab school so that perhaps as time passes, when kids enroll in one of these after-school programs, they can stay in it for a long time. Some of my Gamelan kids, it was funny watching that video. You saw those little girls playing, and I was thinking, wow, you know, 2 of those girls just got their master's degrees, and 1 had a baby. And in the video that these little kids, so some of them have been playing with me for a really long time. And some of the changes and effects we might be looking for might really occur on these larger scales. And also we'd like to be able to have a system where subjects can come in, kids are coming and learning music, and other researchers can come and share our data, or also conduct experiments with kids who are in this intensive program where we're able to control the environment pretty well. So I think that's all we have to say. Thank you for your attention.
We have a couple of minutes for quick clarification questions or things of that nature.
Just what was the Simpsons thing you were talking about?
Oh, we wanted something because collecting that data with the beeps is really boring, and it's really easy to fall asleep listening to beeps for 20 minutes. And so we tried different things. We had kids playing Angry Birds, but that was too noisy. And so finally we figured out that watching silent Simpsons with closed captioning, it kept them enjoying themselves. And we showed them the same episode with Santa's Little Helper. They all watched the same episode. But that at least made it a little bit less boring of an experience for them. That's all it was.
And the beeps and boops are in there.
No, yeah, so they're listening to beeps and boops on headphones, and they're just watching The Simpsons.
So one important thing if you want to do something in a school is that you don't torture your subjects as you can do in a lab. And and the school and the kids should feel that they are getting from the experience as much as you do. So sitting them there and making them listen to beeps and boops was a bad idea.
Just real quick, were any of those pre and post measures that you did in the intervention study, any questionnaires or given to the parents?
That's a good question. I tried with the parents, and in our next study we'll do it again. But what I found is they need to have an interviewer go through the questions with them, because the parent responses were too noisy. I had parents who were maybe very proud of their kid, and they'd circle one circle across all of the most positive things. And then parents who I assume were very angry with their children at that moment and circled all of the worst. And see, there was just too much noise in there, because at least the teachers, they can actually say, compared with all of these other kids. And so what we'll have to do is have a researcher go through the questions with each parent so that we can control that noise a little bit at least.
Great. So we take this opportunity to thank Victor and Alex. Dinner is in the room right across, and it started 3 minutes ago. So